This is Inside the Courtroom, the lori-vallow-trial. We're glad you're here with us as we talk about week 5 of this murder trial that has brought nothing short of wild details in terms of this crime that has sort of gripped our area and the nation, even internationally, people talking about this case. And so we want to make sure that we are bringing you all of the inside information because we aren't allowed to have cameras in the courtroom. However, we do have reporters like Alex Duggan, who has been there throughout this trial. This week started day 1. I think we were about 15 minutes into testimony on Monday this week when we got some of probably the biggest information and the biggest piece of evidence that we have seen. Last week we talked about a huge piece of evidence where we were able to hear that they were able to directly connect Alex Cox to the death of JJ Vallow, the youngest of the 2 children, and his DNA evidence found on tape and plastic that was found around JJ's body. On Monday this week, we were able to then hear information from the expert witness, Keely Coleman. What do we know about Keely?
So she's a DNA analyst with Bodhi Technology, and that is just a private lab that they do a lot of things. They do DNA testing, sexual assault sexual assault kit testing. Mm-hmm. They do those things to clear backlog for police departments, okay. But also police can send certain things over to them to test, just to do more efficient testing in that way. And yeah, she knew her stuff. She's a complete expert. She knew exactly what she was talking about. And she was the one that tested a hair that was found on the duct tape that was found on JJ.
So last week we had talked, and it's very, very clear where they talk to experts who either have, they have very specific expertise. So the person that's doing the fire debris analysis is not the same person that's going to talk about those latent fingerprints. The person talking about fingerprints isn't going to have the blood or hair DNA expertise that we're going to see. So that's why, you are hearing maybe repeats of testimony, if you will, but that's really because we're getting into some of that very specific information, and it's the person best able to speak to that science. Yeah. So Keely was able to talk about a hair found on the duct tape. So we have part of her testimony here. So let's listen in as this is the prosecutor talking to this DNA expert and asking her what she was able to determine and how she was able to determine who that hair belonged to.
How was this evidence processed?
So similar to the process that I described before, a portion of this submitted hair item was taken forward and put into a test tube. It went through a series of washes to get rid of any extraneous DNA that may have been on the hair. We were trying to focus on the hair itself. Then additional reagents and chemicals were added to the sample, and it went through a series of heating and cooling steps to isolate any DNA that may have been present. We determined how much DNA was present in that sample, then made lots and lots of copies, put that on a genetic analyzer, and analyzed the data that was obtained using a computer software program.
What results were obtained from your analysis?
So from the Bodhi item E01, which was the hair sample, a partial female profile was obtained.
And were you able to make any conclusions based on those results?
Yes. Tylee Ryan and Melanie Gibb were excluded as possible contributors of that partial DNA profile. The partial DNA profile matched the DNA profile that was provided for lori-vallow-daybell.
Okay. Did you perform any statistics for the match?
Yes, I did. The probability of randomly selecting an unrelated individual with that partial DNA profile is 1 in 71 billion.
1 in 71 billion.
Yeah.
That would match anyone other than lori-vallow-daybell.
And even so, it's a partial profile, which I think the defense was actually trying to kind of hammer home there. Mm-hmm. She talked a lot about alleles and DNA and how she had missing alleles to this DNA, and that's what happens with the partial profile. But still, even so, she was able to figure that out, and the defense kind of made this example of the jury, and she basically said that their classifications for DNA, and I forget exactly what the term is, but she only needs like 3 parts
Right.
of this DNA, which I don't want to get too technical, but to explain it in like really basic terms, she needs like 3 parts of the specific DNA to be able to determine, or I guess send it back to police with like a definitive answer
Right.
out of 20 of these like alleles or whatever. And so John Thomas gets up and he goes, so basically I only need 3 jurors out of this group, and then that's sufficient enough for you.
Right.
And she was like, well, yeah, but I mean, and we all know like DNA doesn't lie. And it was very specific. And even with a partial profile, it's amazing what they could do. And though it surprised me that the defense didn't say, I guess a lot of people were talking about this, the defense didn't ask her how that hair could have gone there.
No.
And I don't think she could have spoken to that. She's a DNA analyst. Sure. Maybe they bring someone on the stand later who can say how that hair could have gotten there. But a lot of people, you know, to play devil's advocate once again, were like, well, JJ Vallow was her son.
Sure.
Her hair could be all over him.
Sure.
They
and
were,
even Alex, even because we know Alex was connected, and, you know, through that evidence. So we could say, well, we know that Alex and Lori spent a lot of time together, and it wouldn't be odd for any of us to have something in our home, lots of things in our home. If they were analyzed in our home, our car, right? I mean, anything we had access to, if it were analyzed, it would show that likely there would be some sort of our DNA on it.
Right.
And it was interesting because on cross, they really didn't pick apart any of the, you know, kind of where that hair came from, why it was there. And to your point, I think that's exactly why, but she wouldn't have been able to answer that. So it really wasn't paramount to what she was saying. Instead, what they did was kind of try to almost question the magnitude. Like, is this really that big of a deal to have that partial DNA? And I think when we heard about Tylee's DNA last week, I think they were talking about 60-something plus octillion. Now compare that to 1 in 71 billion. That's where you're seeing that the difference between a more complete profile versus a partial profile.
Exactly.
But I don't know anybody who would argue that 1 in 71 billion doesn't make them feel pretty.
Well, she said that basically if you pulled
a random person,
something out of a hat, it would like 1 in 71 billion chance that it would be somebody but her. Right. So that it's not 1 in 71 billion chances that is her. Right. Yeah. It's that it's somebody else, and
it wouldn't match anybody else.
Yeah, and that's a big deal.
Exactly. Yeah. So what about the reaction in the courtroom? Did that seem like a bombshell moment? Did Lori herself have any reaction?
You know, a lot of the time she's just taking notes and talking with her attorneys. I know that a lot of people in the courtroom were shocked because that was just right out of the gate on Monday. That was a bombshell. And then, you know, we went straight into Tammy. Right. So all of us were kind of left like, well, what else? Like, what else is going to happen? Where is this going to go?
And it really was pretty short. The testimony was maybe 15, 20 minutes that this Keely Coleman was on the stand. And, you know, it's interesting because we mentioned that in our last episode. You know, each day we get to hear what's there. We have no way of knowing what's to come.
No, it's a complete mixed bag.
And we sort of said that so we have to say we are right in the middle of allergy season here in Idaho, and so we appreciate that you are battling through that to talk to us. And I apologize you have to sniffle and cough your way through this, but we do appreciate your insight because it's not the same not to have somebody who is in that courtroom, and so we appreciate all the information you bring us. We talked about that last week in terms of, will they have information? We knew once they connected Alex Cox, great. Will there be something as definitive that potentially ties Lori? And there may be more, right? So this was kind of a surprise or interesting. We wondered if that would be there.
Well, they did say, I mean, the prosecution did talk a lot about circumstantial evidence, which is a lot of what we've been saying. We know you can convict somebody on circumstantial evidence, but that's what we expected the whole time. And I did not expect to actually have, physical evidence, right? Regardless of what it means,
and potentially the circumstantial part in this evidence specifically will be what we said. Where did it come from? Couldn't it have gotten there? Just because they know Lori was next to tape or near tape or her hair was on the tape, does that really actually equal she had a part in JJ's death.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
that's that circumstantial part. They did move directly into Tammy Daybell's autopsy and more information about that. So anything out of that was surprising, do you think?
Yeah, so actually we know that Tammy's death was ruled a homicide by asphyxiation. But they brought in Eric Christensen, who is the Utah medical examiner that actually did her autopsy when her body was exhumed in Springville, Utah. And what's interesting about this too is that so Idaho actually has like a coroner system, right? And these coroners are elected, and they don't have as much medical training as a medical examiner. And this guy was saying how these coroners, basically, Utah doesn't have the system, but these coroners ruled her death natural from a pulmonary edema. But he got on the stand and he was like, actually, a pulmonary edema is what happens like after asphyxiation. So yes, that very well could have happened, but that's not what caused pulmonary edema is not the cause of death. It's what happens after asphyxiation can happen. And so he talked a lot about how that's how he kind of knew it was a homicide. And also the interesting thing is that he did this through literally ruling out everything else, which is what they did with JJ. So they rule out every possible scenario, and then that's how they reach their conclusion in these types of things. Whereas a different autopsy, I think they mentioned you can see if someone comes in with a gunshot wound, that's where you start. But with Tammy, you start by eliminating things. And
so heart looks healthy. Heart looks healthy.
Oh,
or, all those things that they're going to look at and say, could it have been a heart attack? Are the signs of a heart attack there? Are there signs of other types of issues? Did they address the foam at all that we talked about last?
They did. He does say that that's consistent with what happens with like a pulmonary edema or asphyxiation, and that's, your lungs aren't getting air. And the defense was like, well, did you test it? And he goes, nope, I don't know why I would test it. That's not, because it's not, I guess, standard. There's really no reason for him to. It's just bodily fluid and I think blood mixed in. But the part that stood out to me was the bruising on her body. And we were able to see pictures of those bruises. And Christensen said, look, these are consistent with restraint. Somebody was restraining her in some way, and he was able to determine even when she was exhumed, so a month or 2 months after she died, that these bruises were caused either in the hours leading up to her death or around the time of death or at the time of death. So really near to when she passed away. And he said it was an acute injury, which means it happened very suddenly, all at once. So
not knocking into something over time. Meaning
exactly.
All of those injuries were caused within a very short period of time of each other.
Right. And the bruises were all on her arms, and I remember, speaking with some people in the courtroom, and because they were, on her upper body, that's, if you're being restrained and suffocated, you wouldn't see bruises on your legs, really.
Right.
It seemed like you could hold somebody down, like her bruises were on the side of her arms right here. And so, we were kind of thinking, is that, if this happened,
right,
someone was holding her down by her arms like this with both of their hands, or we don't know how it happened, but
right.
But he did say, yeah, that seems pretty consistent with
what could have
restraint.
happened. Yeah.
And that honestly made complete sense just based
Sure.
on where the bruises were on her body. She did have one on her chest as well. And that's
new information, and it's information that seems to have been missing. We said last week it was the coroner, and you talked about that initial very quick the story that Chad told, and then very quickly had her buried and kind of moved on past that. It was natural causes, said that she had been sick. So very helpful, I think, I would assume, for prosecutors to be able to bring some of that information, and that now, again, using evidence, using that medical expertise that these medical examiners have, that's what they do, right? That it is always posthumously, this is, after death, that's what they are trained to do, is to look into these clues, to have that information, again, that shows and kind of ties to information that says Daybell's story Chad Daybell's story doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Right? It doesn't add up. And his neighbors also, they took the stand and talked about that because they said his story didn't add up for them either.
No, so actually, I believe it was the Gilberts, and they lived close to the Daybells. And Alice Gilbert was very close with Tammy. They went to church together. They saw each other a couple times a week, all the time. And, she said, I think this part actually stood out to me because, actually Tammy Daybell's birthday, I believe, is tomorrow. And she said that, Tammy would always say, keep it simple, just keep it simple. She was a very simple gal. She was very, calm and collected and sweet. And the Daybell couple was great. She was like, yeah, they seemed like, a good couple. They went to church together, whatever. And then 2019, it kind of changed. Chad was more distant. He didn't, she wouldn't see him as much as she would see Tammy, like them together. And at this point, we know that Chad was having an affair, and Tammy never mentioned it, even though we know that Charles Vallow had emailed her about the affair and stuff, and she never mentioned it to anyone, which I thought was interesting. And when Tammy died, Alice Gilbert went over to the house with her husband, and she said the kids were on the couch. Chad was there. They were already planning the funeral. There were already plans in place for the funeral. And she said that was weird, but she was like, people are grieving. She said the kids were completely stunned. And the funeral was just really quick. It was 3 days after Tammy died. It was in Utah. There was nothing held for her in Idaho besides the memorial her school put on for her to honor her. And Alice Gilbert just cried on the stand, and she went to the funeral in Utah, and she was like, I had to see her for the last time. And then she came back to visit the family and said that they were struggling. But I think at this point, Chad, she said that he didn't seem very emotional. He was very distant. And when she came back those 2 days later, Emma Daybell said that Chad didn't want anything to do with the kids anymore or something like that. So she thought that was strange. Like, he had moved out.
His own kids.
Yeah, so the kids were in the house, but Chad had said he was moving or he was out of the home. He couldn't do it anymore. And he was staying with somebody in Rexburg, a friend. And she kept communication with Chad, but she said nothing added up, and it just seemed off. And then Chad actually told the couple that he was marrying Lori, and they were shocked. Yeah. Completely shocked because
so soon
it was so soon.
This sudden death, unexpected sudden death of his wife.
Exactly. And I think their testimony was, sorry, I'm checking my notes, but yeah, their testimony was interesting because she said she actually confronted him. She started learning things about Lori because they had, I believe they met each other. But he actually, so Lori was put in jail, right, for not producing her kids. And she said Chad asked them for bail help, like her bond hearing happened, and he was like, hey, I'm trying to bail her out. So
for money, for financial help.
So he goes, I'm going to arrange for a bond person to come speak with you guys. And they were like, okay, super just bizarre in the scheme of things, still grieving Tammy. And so then she said, oh, I knew that the kids were missing. I knew this because I was watching the news. I knew Lori, what was going on. And she literally goes, where are the kids, Chad? Does Tylee not deserve a car, a boyfriend, a life? Does she not deserve a life? And I guess his response to her was, well, she didn't like people and she didn't like me. And that was in October, I think. Or not October, November. So, something very, very close, after the kids went missing, obviously, but
an odd response too, considering you're just talking about where's this teenager, and to say, yeah, well, she didn't like people and she didn't like me. Yeah. Isn't, I don't know where she is. We want to find her. Or we know exactly where she is and she's fine. I mean, that's just
Wait, I think it was actually the next year that she confronted him about that. I'm getting my timeline mixed up. But yeah, anyways, she said he told her, well, Tylee didn't like people. Yeah. So it was sometime when Lori got arrested and after all that, and the kids were still missing. But it just I think that rocked a lot of people too, just hearing that, because, and we still have yet to hear if Chad and Lori even said anything about where the kids were to anybody.
Yeah.
So it's still up in the air.
Yeah. And so, in a way, so obvious and so blatant and so out in the open, and yet so much hidden at the very same time.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, even today, the defense was like, did Lori ever say, like, I killed my kids or my kids are dead, you know? Mm-hmm. No. Like, we still have yet to hear that.
Right.
I don't know if we will.
Right.
And that's what circumstantial evidence is.
Yeah,
So
exactly. So today, day 3 of this week, we heard from Lori's friend, and it was a bit of an odd witness interaction that we watched. So let's start with what Audrey initially said. So prosecutors are, the way this works, prosecutors call up their witnesses. Everybody that's testifying right now is a prosecutorial witness. Yep. And then, of course, defense attorneys have the opportunity to cross-examine, so ask their own questions of these folks. And then prosecutors have an opportunity to, again, readdress. So, ask follow-up questions, perhaps needing to clarify. So Audrey gets on the stand. This is Lori's friend. What do we know about their relationship?
So they actually met sometime around, they had the same religious beliefs. So Audrey was friends with Melanie Gibb and in that whole circle, Zelema, Pestennis, and they went to a religious conference together, and Audrey had stayed over at Lori's house in Arizona, and this was at the time when she had invited Chad Daybell over to stay there during this conference. And
this is the doomsday prep sort of readying ourselves for the end of the world, and so she believed that as well. I actually don't recall if she said she believed that, but I think so. They had just similar beliefs about visions and Christ and spirits, spiritual things. Mm-hmm. And she did talk about her beliefs eventually, but basically she said the longer she stayed friends with Lori and Melanie and everybody, the more uncomfortable she became. She went to Hawaii with them. She was in Arizona with them. She went to Utah with them, and she traveled with them a lot. And she knew Chad Daybell really well too. Okay. So Chad would talk about his past lives with her. He even mentioned she was married to Jesus Christ in another life. And yeah, so they got to know each other, but once Lori started talking about, zombies and casting, she said she attended a casting, which is where you cast a demon out of somebody's body. Kind of like an exorcism. I mean, there's a form of an exorcism, if you will. And, Lori tried to do it with Tammy. And she was like, yeah, I was just uncomfortable. And they went to Hawaii, and Melanie was upset about something, and Audrey didn't want to leave her, so she stayed, even though she said, I really wanted to leave. I really wanted to go home. And they went to the beach. They went on bike rides, but she said, I didn't like it. I had fun, but I was uncomfortable, kind of thing. So eventually Lori said, well, I'm going to leave. And Melanie was like, well, I want to stay because I'm upset. And Audrey said, well, I had a big heart, so I didn't want to leave her. So we all flew back to Rexburg together. And they stayed at Lori's apartment, and this is Melanie and Audrey and
Audrey and Lori.
All three of them. Okay.
Mm-hmm. And she kind of gives some background, their friendship and beliefs and stuff. But when they got to Rexburg, she said they were all staying there. She didn't want to leave Melanie alone. And she eventually asked Lori, hey, is there anything weird? This is according to her testimony. Is there anything weird going on? And she said Lori was walking up the stairs at this point, and she turns around and she starts laughing. And she says, you're so naive. You're so trusting. You're gullible. You'll believe anything people tell you. You think the world is all unicorns and rainbows and butterflies, and it's not. And then Audrey says, so that happened, right? So this is where it gets weird. That happened, and then the prosecution is on redirect. They're asking... they were asking stuff about how Lori was treating her, and Audrey says, well, yeah, and then she threatened me, and then blah, blah, blah. And then the prosecution was like, whoa, she threatened you? And she goes, oh, yeah. And then the prosecution said, well, what did she say? And she says, Lori threatened to kill me. She said she would cut me up, something about how she wasn't in the mental place to harm me right now, but she would get herself in that place to do it. She said something about bleach and trash bags, and that she would bury me, and that if I told anyone, that she would come after me in the darkness of night, and that she said something about watching someone take their last breath. And
so did that seem out of the blue? Like
it did.
Did it seem to take prosecutors by surprise?
I think it took a lot of people by surprise, because that was something that wasn't really brought up originally. I feel, and this is just how I feel, is if the prosecution had actually known all this detail, that they would have said something about it right off the bat when she started testifying. Sure. But because, it was kind of a question and answer, like I'm leading you to this, like she threatened me and then she's like, oh, she threatened you kind of thing. I think that it did take them by surprise. Mm-hmm. I don't know for sure, but we know. So this is where it kind of gets tense, because the defense gets up and they say, you're under oath, right? And she says, yes. So
drawing attention to the fact that we don't believe you. I mean, or giving that
yes.
appearance, that reminding her that you have to tell the truth when you are sitting on this stand.
That's what he said. That's exactly what the defense said. Jim Archibald said, I remind you, you're under oath. I remind you that you took an oath to tell the truth on this stand, nothing but the truth. And he goes, you want the jury to believe you just didn't make that last crap up? And all of us were like, whoa, because just, straight up the defense calling it crap.
What she just said, saying, yeah.
Which I've never seen. Mm-hmm. She says, I did make it up. And he was like, well, why didn't you say any of this in your grand jury testimony? So he's saying, when the grand jury convened, which is closed to the public, by the way, and indicted Lori, all these people testified. And I guess she was one of them. Mm-hmm. But Jim Archibald said, this didn't come up in your grand jury testimony. So why are you saying it now?
Yeah.
And she says, well, I was scared. I was scared because I felt threatened that Lori would come after me. She said, Lori said she was going to come after me in the dark of the night. I was nervous. And the prosecution says, well, can we have another follow-up question? And the judge says, nope. So now the jury is just left with that.
Wow.
And we were all left with that. And we were just like,
mm-hmm.
How do you, and it's up to the jury now. It's up to the jury this whole time to determine a witness's credibility.
Sure.
That's the jury's responsibility. And we don't know how credible they're going to find her if the defense gets up and accuses her of lying under oath. Mm-hmm. That's completely up to them. I don't,
Right.
So it was just like
and
crazy.
And how damning will that be if they do? What does that actually look like in terms of, is that enough? What kind of questions, I guess, does that cause jurors to have? Does this witness, how much weight does this witness have? I guess you could argue that she wasn't presenting something of significant evidentiary value in terms of like science and the expertise. Instead, talking about the oddity, I guess, and the sort of the weirdness around Lori's interactions. And you're right. The explanation of her kind of laughing and responding that way on the stairs. Do you think that's what, did it seem initially that that's what prosecutors were actually looking for? Is that sort of response from Lori that didn't seem to match what was happening in real life?
Yeah, I don't know exactly like what even happened. We were also stunned and people are probably like, well, what is Lori's reaction when this is all happening, right? Shocked. I can say like, everyone
responded.
else, she did respond. I believe she like turned her head really quickly and was like talking to her defense attorney and just kind of like looking around. But all of us were pretty shocked. So, but she can't respond to what's going on if someone is lying under oath. Like, it's probably very frustrating.
And it's a crime. It is a crime in and of itself to lie under oath in testimony when you take that oath. But when it's something that is difficult, we're not talking about something that would be easily provable.
No, it's he said, she said.
Right. And so what that will, it will be interesting, I guess, to see kind of where that plays out and how that, if and how that comes back up in later testimony, or if we see that issue of credibility come back up specific to Audrey, Lori's friend who took the stand today. So we appreciate you being inside the courtroom, bringing us all of these details as we continue. We will be back.
And also, just to, one more thing is Ian Pawlowski ended the day today on the stand.
Right.
He is married to Lori-Vallow's niece, Melanie Pawlowski, who is previously married to Brandon Boudreau. So her name was Melanie Boudreau. And
who really Brandon, really the one who started this whole thing.
Yep. The attempted shooting of Brandon, right when he and Melanie were separating. And, you know, I guess the prosecution had some pretty good evidence today where they matched up Alex Cox's device search history with some, you know, where Brandon used to live. And they think that Alex was probably the one to carry out the attempted shooting on Brandon. So that all kind of started today. And Melanie, we know Melanie is very tight with Lori, saw her as a mother. And honestly, you know, Ian's testimony just right off the bat, he said once they got married, they were in Vegas, they got married, and the next day he just felt super uncomfortable because Melanie had dumped all her fears on me. And he said, we didn't get, you know, a explanation as to what those were, but he said he felt nervous and, you know, concerned for people's safety, especially children involved in this. So hopefully we're going to get, you know, some more information about that tomorrow. He will be on the stand tomorrow. And also his wife, Melanie, is expected to testify.
Interesting.
But the thing is, it was brought up today that she said she had heard witness testimony or something along those lines before testiful, which is a no-no.
Yeah, you're not
because
supposed to.
There is a exclusionary rule in place.
And they do ask that of every single witness before or as they're taking the stand. That is one of the questions, just like, you know, taking their oath to tell the truth. That is one of the questions they are asked.
Yeah, and Ian was asked about this, and he said, well, my wife is actually going through some ongoing litigation with Brandon right now, right? So she saw that he had testified, and she was worried about, you know, the litigation going on, and I guess that's the extent of what we heard about it. So who knows if they could literally exclude her. We don't know. But tomorrow we'll find out.
Hopefully at least we'll get, if that happens, we'll hopefully at least get some insight into what it is that she was able to know or what she thinks she heard and how that might impact her witness statement. And even if she's able to make a witness statement, of course, that would be a blow to prosecutors anytime you have someone that you have deemed important to put on the stand. And this is someone who, as you said, incredibly close to Lori and very, very supportive, at least initially. So interesting if we can get into some of that, as you said, dumping some of those fears and potentially, like we've heard from so many people, maybe she saw changes as well. You know, and that seems to be a very, very common theme. So we will wait to hear what he has to offer and then hopefully what Melanie has to offer on the stand. And we will take you back inside the courtroom in just 2 more days after some more testimony in the Lori-Vallow trial. Now, every day you can follow this case online, ktvb.com. Alex is doing a great job tweeting about this as things happen throughout the day. So on our KTVB app, you're getting all the updates. We know that this is a very complex case. We are throwing lots of names at you and lots of different relationships. And so if you want to, I said, sometimes I think you need to draw out something that you've had the family tree. But we have all of those details there. You can certainly research it and, of course, keep following it. And we will see you for the next Inside the Courtroom, the Lori-Vallow trial.